Recently, I was at a birthday celebration for my father. In attendance were he and I, his boss, and two friends of his through work. It is important to note that everyone at this table was white. Now, vocational differences notwithstanding, each of them are in the construction business in some way or other, the conversation was mostly pleasant, except when they talked about work. Lots of questions about my seminary work, what my plans were, do I want kids, etc. I was surprised, in a good way, that we almost reached the end of the meal without any sort of differing viewpoints. Some I found a little bit disagreeable, but nothing terribly so. Then, almost as if I jinxed it, one of them said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Oh, well, it's like those protests last year." Protests, he spat, like it left a bad taste in his mouth. More like riots. He went on to rail against the Black Lives Matter protests in response to the murder of George Floyd. Notably, and perhaps unsurprisingly, he focused on the few people who took advantage of the chaos that nightfall can bring, but never once mentioned the multitudes of peaceful protests and marching across the nation and worldwide. It was never explicitly racist, but he used many of the talking points that are popular with the outlets that tend in that direction. Now, I would love to tell you that I said something. I would love to tell you that I stood up for the protesters and pushed back against these harmful narratives that nurture racism, white supremacy, and police brutality. But I would be a great big liar if I told you that. I was stuck. There were a list of reasons that caused me to feel paralyzed. Notably so, I was the only voice that I could be more than reasonably sure that was not in vehement disagreement. Was in vehement disagreement. Other factors, including a 20 to 30-year age gap between myself and the men at the table, quite significant class differences. One of the men at the table was my dad's boss, and no shortage of power dynamic issues came into play. And I found myself horrified with my hands covering my mouth, completely silent. And that bothered me. Now, as a predominantly white congregation, we all know by now that a lot of this difficult educational work with white people that needs to be done around anti-racism work is not the responsibility of Black, Indigenous, or people of color. Indeed, it has to be within our own identifying communities. This is twofold, by the way. It's also not the job of our communities to police BIPOC people, but a little more on that later. We know this is the work we have to do, and I was too scared to do it. And that speaks a lot to my privilege as a white person. I was too uncomfortable, so I didn't say anything. I had the luxury of exactly that. And that is not a luxury that is afforded to minoritized communities. During the protests in Ferguson that followed the death of Mike Brown, does anyone here know what the local Unitarian Universalist Church did? Did they march with the protesters? Did they speak out against the racism that played a foundational role in Mike's death? Did they condemn the police force's actions? No. They didn't do any of that. What they did do as a whole, much to their minister's chagrin, was exactly the opposite. That's not our fight. That's none of our business. We don't need to get involved in that. And what an absolute failure of all things we hold in esteem as Unitarian Universalists. It took them nearly 2 weeks to have any sort of meaningful response. All the while, there were young Black folks marching every night and organizing every day. Those young people had a really interesting response to the Black churches in the area as well. In Ferguson and Faith, by author Leah Gunning Francis. She interviewed a number of those young people and often heard the same thing regarding the churches. You weren't here before, now you want to pretend to help? Local faith leaders had to pivot very quickly to find ways to support the protesters without centering themselves in the conversation. And that's where we as UUs have to begin thinking. Again, as a predominantly white community, as most UUs are, we have many privileges given to us that our BIPOC siblings do not have. We aren't seen as bossy or angry if we speak up. A symptom of white supremacy culture is, by and large, that the opinions and the voices of white people are favored over those of minoritized communities. We'd rather hear someone who looks like us than listen to those with the actual experiences that we need to know about. But what do we do with those privileges that we do have? Like the faith leaders in Ferguson, we need to be able to know when our words and work will do the greatest good, and which words and work to use when. How we help depends greatly on the spaces that we're in. We've got to read the room. Are we reflected in the faces that we see? Let's speak directly to those situations where our words can do the best work. When we're in the room with people who share our racial and cultural identities, this is our best opportunity to do this really hard work. This is the time to call our loved ones in and to have these really tough conversations. I'm curious, how many of you at Thanksgiving this week had the opportunity to do that? Did you? If you didn't, was some of that for some of the same reasons that I didn't during that sushi lunch a couple weeks ago? It's hard, right, to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations, and the holidays absolutely feel like the wrong time to do it. At the very least, I challenge you to do as Reverend Kent recommended to me those weeks ago. Make it known that their viewpoint is not the norm, even if it's just disagreeing. I don't share that viewpoint. End of story. We have to meet people where they are. We won't change the world by calling out bad behavior. Shame and humiliation only serve to create the opposite effect. But we have to make the conscious choice on how we approach these sorts of conversations, and it's not a bad idea to do so with grace and patience. But we have to have these conversations whenever possible. Letting those teachable moments pass us by does us a disservice as a community. And when we're burnt out, when we're feeling like we can't possibly have one more conversation, we can't hear about one more instance of police brutality, can't bear one more display of white supremacy, I challenge you then to really dig into the work. Don't disengage, don't tune it out. Make the effort to stay in it. Our BIPOC friends and family do not have the luxury of ignoring it. We shouldn't have that luxury either. I know this work is uncomfortable and sometimes a little scary. We run the risk of creating heated discussions at best and full-blown arguments at worst. Worries of fractured relationships can keep us silent. This is the least of the discomfort that we can work through. Discrimination of any kind is harmful, and it is up to those of us not in the line of fire to put out those flames. On the flip side, how we engage with those situations where our voices aren't needed is equally important. How do we know when our voices should be heard or not? Really good rule of thumb is to ask ourselves, does what I have to say take the focus away from someone else? I asked a close friend of mine last week who identifies as a Mexican man what he would want to see happen in these conversations. And after a long period of thought, he said, I get that oppression is intersectional, but when I'm talking about my experiences with oppression, it is unhelpful to hear people who don't share those experiences bring in their own. It's like they're not listening. It's like they're just waiting to talk. In other words, it's not the oppression Olympics. Yeah, you're going to remember that one. One person's experience is not more or less valid than any other, but sometimes we forget in our very human desire to connect to others that the conversation isn't always about us. You can think of it in terms of the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter argument. No one ever said that Black lives matter more than anyone else, or that they were the only lives that mattered. But the conversation is focused on those lives because after centuries of continued oppression, racism, and terrorism within Black communities by white people, after all they've endured, that's who the focus is on. So sometimes, even when we feel like we understand, we don't need to say anything. Indeed, that may be one of the best times to stop talking and listen, because that's where our side in this piece is, listening and learning in order to support. During the Ferguson demonstrations, and please note my deliberate use of the word demonstrations and not riots, as we so often heard in the news, some of the most effective support came from the surrounding community, not by speaking out of place for those organizers. Some of the local congregations opened their doors to the organizers so that they would have a place to meet and organize the next night's marches and demonstrations. Other congregations made food and supplied drinks and places of respite. Others still stood outside of police stations making phone call after phone call in order to secure legal representation for detainees and worked tirelessly to get people released. Day in, day out, that nose-to-the-grind practical support work was what really made the most differences from those communities. It helps facilitate the trust between parties, and it does not make those who need to be heard feel like they're being spoken over. Finding those ways in which to take part in supporting roles, making sure you're amplifying those voices that need to be heard, using your connections in ways that support the cause, donating money at every step you get, if able. These are the steps that we can use our privilege and our influence when our voices do not need to be centered. Maybe it's making phone calls or making signs, participating in the demonstrations, fundraising, any number of things that you can do for regular social justice work is important to make sure we're doing in these moments. This is what makes people feel supported and heard. That includes supporting them when they do things that we might not like. In a 1966 interview with Mike Wallace, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said the following: "I think we've got to see that the riot is the language of the unheard." Coming from the lips of one of the most preeminent leaders of the nonviolence movement, these are striking words. Words that show an understanding of why people were willing to engage in a type of protest that he didn't agree with. He never condemned these actions. He accepted them for what they were and supported their right to protest as they saw fit. We have the same obligation. With the very Unitarian history of affluence and wealth, it is so easy to sit back and say what we think people should be doing. No one will listen if you talk too loud. Oh, what does violence fix? That's not how I would do it if it were me. I'm here to tell you right now, it does not matter what we think things should be done. The language of the unheard is a completely different language than that of the people who make the rules. It is our job to learn that language and support causes that move us to a place where the languages will one day, hopefully, share more commonality. Change cannot happen if we don't learn, and learning begins with listening, even if we don't like or understand what we're hearing. Indeed, perhaps most when we're uncomfortable with what we're hearing. We have to consider that silence is violence. When we let a small stereotype slide in the company of others that reflect us, that's violence. When we hear or see a not-so-microaggression towards someone else and we don't acknowledge it, that is violence. When we speak over and disregard those who are oppressed by systems of oppression that have been woven into the very fabric of our society, that is violence. The heart of nonviolent protest is action. Complicity only serves to undermine the nature of our principles as Unitarian Universalists, and more pressingly, further deteriorates the trust between people when working together in community is paramount to anti-racism work and anti-oppression work. Our privilege gives us a choice, and we are wise to choose the right side of history. A final note. I have focused very much today on how we show up and do the right work to best bend toward racial justice. It cannot be understated that this work must also, too, be done in other areas where inequity and inequality still reign. This work transcends class and wealth, physical and mental ability, gender, sexual orientation. Where there is injustice of any kind, this work can and must continue to be done. And the same principles still hold true. We support, we speak up. We're gonna get it wrong sometimes, guys. We apologize, we learn, we do better, and we move on. May we choose to set aside our discomforts in order to work towards justice for all, everywhere. Amen.